Have you ever wondered how these cute cartoony style portraits are made? If yes, you are in the right place because today I'm going to show you my work process of how I create a cartoony portrait in my art style, from ideation to the final portrait. I'm Zara, a freelance artist. I illustrate children's books, take on personal commissions, and pretty much work on anything that calls for a cute and adorable illustrations. Let's get into the video. For any project, it all starts with knowing what the client is looking for. I start by jotting down all the initial requirements of the client, no matter how big or small they are, because every tiny detail counts. After that, I like to have a conversation with them to know more about the story behind the illustration. This helps me understand their vision better and also gives me the chance to suggest some of my ideas based on their story. I really value this part of the process because oftentimes clients are not entirely sure about what they're really looking for, because they might not be familiar with how the creative process works. So it's my job to guide the conversation and make things easier for them. This process is crucial for both of us because the more I know their story, the better I can turn it into a portrait that feels more personal. On the other hand, it also gives me a plenty of creative possibilities to play with when deciding which elements to include for a beautiful and balanced composition. The next thing is I make sure to collect proper reference images. I always request clients to send clear, good quality photos and avoid selfies or pictures with heavy filters. This is so important, especially because my portraits are cartoony by nature. They won't look exactly like a photograph. So I need good reference images to observe and capture those tiny details that make each person recognizable in their cartoony version. This is one of my favorite parts of the entire process because this is where I get to loosen up a little, scribble out ideas, and let things flow naturally. The two main things I focus on here are figuring out the composition and getting the facial resemblance right. For the composition part, I start by roughly sketching out the character and placing the background elements around them. Then I play around with their positions just to see what works best for the composition. I also decide the pose and gesture of the character in this stage because that also plays a major role in the overall composition. Once I'm happy with how everything sits together, I move on to the next part of the rough sketch, which is refining the rough sketch. For this, I reduce the opacity of the rough sketch layer and create a new layer on top of it to draw over the rough sketch. But this time, instead of a scribbly rough lines, I draw more intentionally to give a good structure to the illustration. While refining, I also start focusing on facial similarities of the character. For the facial resemblance, I start by observing the reference images and identify what features make that person unique. Then I try to capture them in the portrait while still keeping it cartoony. The usual things I do to maintain that cartoony feel are making the eyes a little bigger, using curvier lines, and choosing more softer shapes. Keeping all these gentle things aside, the key is to highlight and exaggerate those unique features that make each person look like themselves without losing their identity. After that, I refine the entire sketch again. I typically go over the sketch around 2 to 3 times until I feel completely confident with it. Because once I move on to the inking stage, I prefer not to make any big changes. So it's really important for me to get all my decisions right in this stage. Before I move on to the next stage, I send this rough sketch to the client for approval. So I make sure everything they requested is there, and the rough sketch gives them a clear idea of what the final illustration will look like. Because once the illustration is done, I want there to be no surprises. So this stage is where I carefully log everything in. Once the client approves the sketch after a couple of rounds of feedback and some corrections, I move on to the inking phase. This is where I bring clean lines to the sketch and lock everything in. I prefer to use a slightly textured brush to give the line work a handmade feel while still keeping it neat and tidy. Since most of the decisions were already made in the rough sketch, this stage is more about staying patient and cleaning things up. It's just like tracing the rough sketch. For me, inking is the most relaxing part. So I just put on some of my favorite music and get into the zone. While I'm inking, I also start dropping in the base colors. This helps me see the negative spaces and how the shapes interact with each other. Once the flat colors are in, it becomes easier to spot if something feels slightly off. For the base colors, I usually pick a random skin tone for the character and use any light colors for background. The goal here is just to block in the color areas and get a clear view of the composition. And now with the base colors blocked in, I move on to picking the final colors. So once the base colors are in, I start thinking about the actual color palette. When it comes to choosing the color palette, I always start by thinking about the overall mood of the illustration. Is it meant to feel happy, dreamy, or emotional? Once that's clear, I pick one or two main colors that really reflect that mood. Then I build the rest of the palette around them. For example, in this artwork, the client told me it was a gift for her friend who had just gotten a promotion at work. She wanted to congratulate him with this illustration and include all the things he loves. So I went for a bright and cheerful vibe, like using more warm tones. She also mentioned his character as someone who's calm and loving. So I went for softer pastel shades to reflect that warmth and softness in the overall vibe. And of course, there's always a bit of trial and error throughout the process. I tweak the colors and values here and there until I feel completely okay with it. Overall, choosing colors is part instinct, part experience, and part happy accidents. Now let's talk about shadows and lighting, the part that always sounds dramatic, but for commission portraits, I actually keep them pretty minimal because I don't want the portrait to look super rendered. And that's not my style either. The first thing I do is deciding where the light source is coming from. Once that's set, everything else just falls into place. That single choice guides the entire illustration. The character, the background, even the little doodles, they all respond to the same light so that the whole illustration feels nice and cohesive. For this particular project, the mood was already said to be bright and cheerful. So I went for a sunny day vibe with the light source being the sun, meaning the light is warm and yellow. Depending on the mood I'm aiming for, I adjust the lighting setup. It could mean choosing softer light source, combining different light sources, or bringing in different colored lights to match the overall feel of the illustration. About the brushes, I use a soft brush to add the gentle glow of the light. And for the highlights, I go back to the same brush I use for inking. Now comes the shadow part. Shadow is nothing but where the light is not. It's as simple as that. I usually work with two shadow values, a mid-tone shadow and a deeper one for the areas where light can't reach. Using these two values is more than enough to give any illustration a nice depth. And I use the same texture brush which I use for inking and highlighting so that the overall feel of the illustration stays consistent. When I'm using a warm light source like yellow sunlight, I typically lean into cool tones for shadows like blues or purples, depending on the base color. These cooler tones help balance the warmth in the lighting, and most of the time it's just those two colors I play with. Then there is color variation, a small detail that makes a big difference. Instead of using a flat colors across the board, I introduce subtle variations within the same value range and color family. For example, when painting skin, I'll add reddish or orangish tone to the cheek and nose areas where blood vessels are more visible because of the thinness of the skin. It brings the character to life. This is not only for skin tone. If I'm drawing something like a leaf, I won't just stick to one shade of green. I'll blend in a couple of green tones to make it feel more natural and dynamic. This is the part where I step back, zoom out and see the artwork from a distance. The typical things I do in this stage is adding textures, some highlights and some doodles and text. I also experiment with background colors to see what complements the illustration best. And that's how a commissioned portrait comes to life, from blank canvas to something that hopefully makes someone smile. Portraits have always been a curious thing for me. There's this constant tug of war in my head. Should I keep doing this or take a break from this chaos? Because let's be real, commissioned portraits are not always easy. Sometimes the clients aren't completely happy with the final illustrations and they keep asking for tiny adjustments until I forget what I was even drawing. And suddenly the joy turns into overthinking. I sit there wondering, did I really get it all wrong? And start doubting my skills. But then there are those moments when I send the final illustration and get some heartfelt replies. That soft smile when someone sees themselves as a little cartoon version. That rush of joy in their message. The compliment that turns my entire day around. That's the reason I keep coming back to drawing portraits. Because I do love drawing people. I always have, from my school and college days, sketching my friends just for fun, to now, years later, the feeling of giving someone a version of themselves, hand-drawn and full of character, still fills me with something I can't quite describe. Maybe that's why I can never fully stop, because deep down I have always loved drawing faces. I'm still figuring things out, still growing, still navigating this wild ride of making art for others. But one thing I know for sure, I have a soft spot for drawing people and making them smile. And that's something I want to hold on to. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this little behind the scenes of my work process as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I have got more coming up, so I'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep creating. Bye bye.